Welcome to Dairy Livestream. I'm your host, Corey Geiger, managing editor of Horde's Dairyman. We are broadcasting from the Cheese Cave, our studio in downtown Fort Atkinson at the historic W.D. Horde & Sons Company building commissioned by Wisconsin Governor W.D. Horde. What's the future of ag labor laws? Overall, the labor force is experiencing unique ramifications due to COVID-19. Many employers, including dairy farmers and dairy processors, are having trouble hiring enough workers. In fact, companies are taking extraordinary measures to keep their lines running. According to a recent Wall Street Journal article, at a Wisconsin dairy plant, managers have been asking employees to cancel vacations, and that company recently even asked a maintenance worker to help make cheese, and that's an end quote in that story. While many remain unemployed, some Americans are no longer in the job market. The labor participation rate, defined as the proportion of working-age Americans with a job or actively looking for one, is at low levels not seen since the late 1970s, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Then there's the matter of overtime and minimum wage. States such as New York, California, and Washington State are facing new rules that will impact agriculture and the way we farm. We have guests today from both New York and hopefully California to discuss the matter. As you hear from our panelists on ag labor, please submit your questions in the GoToMeeting webinar control panel under the question area. Our team here in Fort Atkinson, Caitlin Allen, will be editing those questions. We'll ask them in the second half of the webcast. As a prelude to our first guest, let's go to a poll question. New York farm workers start receiving overtime after how many hours in a week? Select one of the following: A, 40 hours a week, B, 50 hours a week, C, 60 hours a week, or D, 70 hours per week. So let's go ahead and answer that poll question here. And we're collecting a response. We're getting extremely strong and quick participation today, so people are all ready to go here. Caitlin, you can go ahead and close that poll. And our answer here, a little bit all over the board, but the 44% answer is correct, that 60 hours a week in New York. And our first, and that's as of January 2020, so we're talking 13 months ago. Our first Dairy Livestream panelist will shed some light on the future of ag labor laws. In his role at Cornell University, Rich Stoop provides leadership as a liaison between agricultural industry and employment-focused regulatory authorities. His focus is on human resource management, enhancing employee engagement, regulatory compliance, and leadership development at the farm level. Prior to joining Cornell University, Rich founded Ag Workforce Development, a firm focused on improving individual and team performance through organizational development and technology solutions. He also served agriculture in the farm credit system as a branch manager and senior leader, gaining extensive experience leading teams in sales, credit, accounting and records, business consulting, risk management, and crop insurance. Rich, I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts on what's the future of ag labor laws. Rich?
All right, thanks, Corey, and thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm really glad to be on the program. So I'd like to start out with a quick backgrounder on how we got to where we are with farm labor laws today. So in the 1930s, during the Great Depression, a series of foundational labor laws were passed with the purpose of protecting workers and forcing employers to create more jobs. The National Labor Relations Act authorized unions, and the Fair Labor Standards Act restricted child labor and created the 40-hour work week with overtime required beyond that. Congress passed these laws after compromises led by rural and southern states to carve out farm labor from the new labor rules. Subsequently, state legislatures throughout the country also recognized that farm jobs were different from other jobs, and they created similar carve-outs from state labor laws to treat farm labor differently from most other industries. So how this works today is that we have federal and state labor laws, and most states mirror the federal laws to a large degree. But when there are differences, whichever law is most restrictive or protective depending on your point of view, is the law that operates for you. For example, federal minimum wage is still $7.25. But in New York, the minimum wage is now $12.50 for most of the upstate outside of New York City. It's higher in New York City. So employers there, where the dairy farms are, must use the $12.50 because the state one is higher. So the Fair Labor Standards Act created overtime for a specific purpose. So back in the Depression, during the Depression, some people had jobs and employers worked them for very long hours, while a lot of other people were unemployed. The purpose of overtime as a government policy was to force employers to create more jobs and hire more of the people who had no work. It was a policy designed to create more jobs during a time of high unemployment. This is in contrast with recent state actions to implement overtime in farm labor when unemployment was very low and employees are hard to find. Today, we find states in various places across the country making changes to their laws that affect farm employees. Overtime exists at various levels for at least some farm employees in Maryland, which is at 60 hours, Minnesota, which is at 40 hours, and I won't share what California is. New York, already mentioned, was at 60, and also Washington State recently had a change, but I won't share what the hours are at this point in Washington State. Washington State dairy is a special case. So their state Supreme Court ruled that the state's exemptions for farm labor were unconstitutional because dairy farm jobs are hazardous. As a result, Washington State dairy farmers now have to pay overtime, and they are currently fighting to avoid having to pay retroactive overtime going back years, which, as you can imagine, having to pay overtime back for years for employees could be financially catastrophic for them. So closer to home for me here in New York, the state legislature made major changes to farm labor laws in 2019, and which went into effect in 2020. This included overtime at 60 hours a week, a required weekly day of rest, and authorization of farm employee unions. There are exemptions from these laws for certain family members and for certain management employees, but they're rather strict to meet those exemptions. A wage board consisting of 3 people, 1 from industry, 1 from a union representative, and 1 from the public, spent the last year studying the possibility of reducing the overtime threshold below 60, and they could go as low as 40 or somewhere in between. But due to the COVID-19 pandemic, they decided to recommend keeping the 60-hour threshold for 2021. So all these changes in New York are the result of a 40-year political battle in the states, and they've really left the industry in an uncertain position with clearly higher labor costs than most other states and Canada, which is right next door. So all of these changes are happening at a time when farms struggle to find enough employees. Some places can still draw from a local labor pool, but it's hard when communities are increasingly disconnected from farms and don't view farms as viable employers. Immigration to the U.S. went down dramatically since the peak times back in the 90s and early 2000s. In those days, farmers had potential employees knocking on their office doors. Due to tighter border control, more aggressive enforcement, and demographic factors in Mexico's developing economy, there's just not as much push for people to immigrate to the U.S. for work as there used to be. All of these factors are combining to make farmers rethink labor strategies, including adopting an array of technologies to make each worker more productive, and in some cases, to reduce the need for employees altogether. I think that the future for dairy employment is high tech, high productivity, high skill, and high wage jobs. Unfortunately, the silver lining here is that the industry will be much better able to recruit people from all walks of life to fill these types of future jobs.
Well, thank you, Rich. I really appreciate those insights here. And as a reminder to our audience today, we're getting some questions in already. And as you hear our panelists on ag labor, please submit your questions to GoToWebinar question panel. Also, I want to remind our audience that each of our Dairy Livestream webcasts are archived the very next day at the Hordes Dairyman website and our YouTube channel. Before we invite our next guest, and we had a little bit of technical difficulties, but I do believe we have Frank here on audio. So We're going to go to the next poll question. And our next poll question is this. On California farms with over 26 employees, overtime starts after how many hours this year? Select one answer. 40 hours a week, 45 hours a week, 50 hours a week, or 55 hours a week. So we'll let our audience go ahead and do that. And again, we're getting extremely strong participation here on this topic here. So Caitlin, you can go ahead and cut the poll off there. We'll pop that answers up. A lot of people said 49%, and indeed in 2022, that will be the correct answer. In 2021, the correct answer is 45 hours. Our next guest, Frank Cardoza of Tulare, California, has been living out this situation each and every day as a consultant with DairyWorks, which is a non-farm management company that helps dairymen and dairywomen and their employees overcome some of the day-to-day challenges. Frank also manages Philip Verwey Farms. Their mission is to create a good working environment that will attract hardworking individuals who want a career in the dairy industry. Taking that one step further, Frank works hard to improve three areas. First, create good jobs that will help our employees succeed. Second, ensure that we are doing everything possible to take care of our animals. And third, take care of the environment by always conserving water and doing our part to control air quality. Before we welcome Frank to Dairy Livestream, let's go back to that poll question. And again, this year, agriculture workers on farms with more than 26 employees in California must pay overtime after a 45-hour work week, and that number gets trimmed to 40 next year. What about those farms with 25 or fewer employees? They must begin paying overtime after 40 hours beginning in 2025, and that phase-in period began this year at 55 hours. Frank, let's talk labor in California.
Okay, yeah. No, it's definitely becoming a challenge. You know, every January 1st, you have to decide on what changes you're going to make to be successful in this industry. And for sure, we've looked at different options and we've tried different options as far as hiring more people and reducing hours. But in our case, we always look at it's just better for us to pay the overtime, and the employee actually makes more money, so he seems to be happier. So yeah, it's a challenge every January, but the margins are so tight right now that we are running with a thin crew, and it's just very hard to cut back anymore and still meet the expectations on animal health and milk quality. So yeah, we're constantly working on how we can bring in technology. I mean, you guys talked about creating better jobs that will fit that model to where you can encourage younger people to come into the business and yet still have people that want to work, do the physical jobs that are required on dairy. So it definitely becomes a challenge.
Frank, we can hear your audio crystal clear. And yesterday when we were, our audience probably gathers that we do have a little pregame meeting here with our panelists here. And Frank, you shared a compelling story on egg labor. A lot has changed in farming economics since your parents immigrated to the United States and California more specifically from Portugal just one generation ago. Please share some insight as it relates to egg labor these days.
Yeah, so back in my parents immigrated from Portugal. I was born in Brazil and came to the United States in 1972. And back then, there was the opportunity to work very hard on farms. I mean, my dad, there was no days off for him. He had a passion for dairy and the opportunity to someday own your own dairy and business and pass that on to the family. That was that was a great motivator for anybody who immigrated to the U.S. And today, the difference is that young kids, or even anybody that's working on a dairy, and the challenge for a dairyman is that he doesn't have that opportunity to start a business in the dairy industry, or dairy, a dairy in specific. You don't have that to where you can work hard and start your own dairy. Very few people can do that, and it requires a lot of money that not a lot of us can afford to do that. So it's a challenge to get people that want to come onto dairies and ask the question is, where am I going to be at with this industry in 5-10 years? I mean, where is it going to grow? Am I going to have the opportunity to benefit from working that hard on a dairy and grow from it? And it's a challenge for a dairyman because, you can only reach the limits, and then that's it. And so I think the mindset in the industry, it has changed because of that. You just don't have that passion that we had years ago. And not that I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it. It's just times have changed. And I think the only way, as far as us on the dairy, we have individuals that are promoted from within the company. They reach a certain point, and then they move on to other opportunities. And I think that's the only step that we can do is teach people how to teach and develop people to be able to go out and work for a better company than ours. I mean, and then we have individuals that have been with us for many years, and I think they're going to retire with us. So I think that's how, for us, that's how we've tried to retain employees is just have them, teach them and give them the opportunity to make a decision on where they want to go in their lives.
Thank you, Frank, for that additional insight. And we're going to go to Chris Wolf here, and then we're going to open it up for questions from Rich and Frank and Chris Wolf. And again, Frank Cardoza is joining us from California, in audio only. But let's go to one more poll question. And Rich Stoop talked about this to some degree. Based on a Washington State Supreme Court ruling in November, overtime now starts at how many hours in that state? 40 hours a week, 50 hours a week, 60 hours a week, or 70 hours a week? Go ahead and answer that question. And one answer is leading the polls quite strongly here. So we're just over the 50% mark. We'll just wait because Caitlin cut her off, so we'll go with that. And the correct answer is 61% is 40 hours per week. And this past November, as Rich discussed, the Washington State Supreme Court, and I want to say Washington State, not this Washington, D.C., Washington State Supreme Court ruled 5-4 that dairy workers are entitled to overtime pay if they work more than 40 hours. That means Washington state law now preempts a 60+ year federal law exempting agriculture from paying overtime. Chris, I had a couple of viewers want to know if you saw your shadow yesterday in a reference to Groundhog Day, and given you got 23 inches of snow, I'm guessing we already know the answer to that. But more seriously, Chris, rulings of this nature surely will change ag labor. What is your take on the matter?
Well, thanks, Corey. Glad to be here this morning. Yeah, I think maybe there are parts of the country where they care whether this groundhog sees its shadow or not. I think when you live in Ithaca, New York, there's always 6 more weeks of winter. So, and it definitely feels like it today. But I'm happy to be here talking about this topic with these 2 economists that deal with it a lot. I think there's a tendency to reflect back on how things used to be in many aspects of life. And I think this is particularly true with dairy farmers who can recall 1 or 2 generations ago when there were less issues to worry about related to environmental management, to animal welfare, and to labor and human resource management that we're talking about today. Unfortunately, from that perspective, I don't think these management challenges are likely to recede in the future. And so the best option is to be informed and have a plan. With respect to labor management on dairy farms, I think it's important to consider that labor costs are one of the top costs of milk production, particularly if you consider unpaid family labor and the opportunity cost that goes with unpaid family labor. And past research, in fact, I've done research where we found that labor cost and labor efficiency were the single most highly correlated factor with dairy farm profitability. Human resource management risk is also a primary risk for dairy farms, right? So the cows have to be milked at least twice daily. And so having the availability of healthy and available and affordable workers is increasingly important, and having a plan to deal with that is a primary part of risk management, I think, on a dairy farm in the U.S. today. And the human resource management risk occurs both at the farm level, as far as what's going on locally with that farm and labor availability and incentives, and also at the federal level when we think about things like immigration policy, which is not really a focus today, but kind of is an issue to consider all the time on the future of ag labor in this country. Rich did a really nice job of kind of talking about the history and how we got to where we're at, and kind of how we're now having a patchwork of different regulations and rules, where if the state rules are more stringent or higher minimum wage or different overtime laws, then those bind first, right? So we're getting into a situation where we have this patchwork of potential labor cost differences and comparative advantages, just like we also have in other things like environmental rules and things of that nature. And I think the key there is that consumers and really society at large is just increasingly concerned about how their food is produced. And this includes how they perceive that employees are treated. The Farmers Assuring Responsible Management Program with National Milk has a section on workforce development to provide information for farmers. You can go there. They've got fact sheets on federal and state laws that are really useful. And remember, right, the overall goal of the farm program is to maintain the social license to produce. So when we started with animal welfare, but we've also got workforce development, because the key here is when the public loses confidence in the ability of an industry to police itself, then one potential result is more regulation, right? So the primary goal of a program like that is to maintain consumer confidence, market access, and avoid unnecessary regulation. And the regulations that have been in the news recently, which Rich did a good job of talking about, related to dairy labor, are overtime and potential minimum wage increases some places, but potentially we're talking about it at a national level. So then we get into things from an economic point of view, like worrying about if the minimum wage is uniform across the country, it's going to have much bigger effects in some areas than others. And rural areas are some of the areas where it might have a bigger effect. And as an economist, we worry about things like wage compression, where when we bring up the lower paid workers, then we potentially result in small differences in pay across workers in a firm, even though there might be large differences in responsibilities and skills and qualifications. We have situations where new employees can end up making more than existing or longer term employees, and that can lead to losses in motivation and friction in the workplace. I think it's important to consider that the ways in which these regulations are implemented and enforced is really important. Because dairy farms are unique and heterogeneous in size and methods and geography and technology and all that. It's important to allow flexibility in the implementation so that farmers can innovate, right? So what we're looking for here, hopefully, is a set of standards rather than mandating methods and which might advantage some farms more than others. And then let me just kind of finish up by saying that one of the results of these changes in ag labor going forward is to increase the cost of labor relative to capital, right? So over time, we're seeing if labor becomes more expensive relative to technology that you might use, the labor-saving technology, then we're seeing more investments in that labor-saving technology across herds in all different areas of all different sizes. And that's going to continue to be important. And that's part of the kind of discussion we're having, because we're talking about major investments in dairy farms, and smart investments are the way that you are around in the long run. And that's another big part of financial risk management. So I'll just kind of wrap it up there. Looking forward to the discussion.
Well, thank you again. And as a reminder to our guests here, our audience members, again, you can ask questions in our GoToWebinar control panel there. Look under the question area. And we have a number of questions coming in here. And each of the panelists here, we got Richard Stoop, Chris Wolf, and then Frank Cardoza joining us from California in audio. Everybody's touched on this a little bit, but let's dig a little bit deeper in a kind of a round robin thing here. We'll start with Rich, go to Frank, and then Chris can clean up on this one. From your regional perspective or your state, what is the motivation in your local area behind each state, such as California or New York, as introducing these overtime and wage restrictions now compared to 10 years ago, 20 years ago? Has something changed about the perception between farm employers and farm workers? Rich?
Yeah, that's a really good point, and it's complex. As I mentioned earlier, this has really been a 40-year battle in New York, so it's not like it's new. But what happened was that the side that was pushing for increased restrictions on farm labor, or frankly, they want to move farm labor more into alignment with the rest of the economy and under that Fair Labor Standards Act, like at the federal level. It's been worker advocate groups that have been driving that for years. Now it's increasingly unions. So unions, I think, perceive any part of the population that has a different labor standard, for example, a higher overtime threshold than 40 hours, they perceive that as a threat because there's a potential there. If this part of the population has this different role, then that could potentially apply to those under the union controls as well, or the rest of the economy. So some of those factors that were driving it. But it's insightful that you point out about the relationship between employers and employees. It's in a couple of pieces I want to pull together here. Chris mentioned risk management, and the reality, if we step back and take a look at it, we've become very dependent on, in many cases, an unauthorized labor force. We've had a lot of immigrant employees, some of whom have been here many years and have gotten themselves into a good legal status of some kind, but we know that there's a significant portion that are not fully authorized to work in the United States. That's a huge risk. A lot of ways we've gotten used to it, but it's a huge risk. So whenever enforcement ticks up, we've certainly seen stories of dairies that have lost their workforce for a period of time and that sort of thing. And that situation has certainly not gone unnoticed by the public at large. And I would say here during COVID-19, there's been a spotlight, not just dairy, but across agriculture, looking at the workforce and who is the workforce. And I believe that consumers are certainly more interested, and part of that certainly is driven by worker advocates and so forth that have been trying to highlight the issue and trying to make a lot of news out of any particular problems that are out there in the workforce. And so all these things are coming together, not to mention just the connectivity. People with the internet and with social media, people are able to access and see things that they weren't able to decades ago. And so that's increased awareness. And so folks downstream, whether it's milk buyers, marketers, retailers, they are aware of this increased consumer consciousness, and so they've started to put pressure on it. Part of that's evidenced by the farms adding the workforce development component to the FARN program, as well as some other things that have taken place. So in Vermont, we have the Ben & Jerry's program that was put in place, and that's a combination of working with a worker advocacy group there to set a kind of standards in place for worker well-being. And so that's something that got a lot of press. It hasn't grown from that initial program, but it certainly has other processors and retailers looking at it and considering, how can I make sure that there aren't worker well-being problems in my supply chain. And I think that's something as an industry we need to be fully aware of. And in fact, I think as an industry we need to get ahead of that. Rather than having legislators or consumers telling the industry what to do, the industry needs to get ahead of this, make sure we're doing an excellent job taking care of employees and making sure that people have, excellent pay, excellent benefits, that the atmosphere is good to work in. And when we don't have that, then we're going to have outside groups coming after the industry and trying to initiate these things through law.
Frank, in California, what do you think changed over time here to bring this evolution from taking overtime pay from 55 hours and slowly moving it down to 40? What changed in your area?
Well, Richard is right on. It's a complex topic, and what's changed is that you have other industries that are working so many hours, and the dairy industry where guys, we're working 10 hours and not getting that 2 hours of overtime pay. So there's it's just something that it was going to change anyways, because there's in the public side, they feel that it's a job and it's a hard job, and we're not treating the employees fairly. So, and I'm not against any of that. I think we've made a huge improvement on animal welfare. Things that we used to do as I was a kid are not acceptable now, and it's a good thing. And same thing with labor laws. Things have changed, and I think it's a good thing. What's really complex about it, and it's a very difficult subject, is the dairyman is in the middle. Recently, I had a huge number of employees come over from Walmart, and they come over and they work, and then they call it in sick. I says, well, why are you sick? Well, I just don't want to go to work. I says, well, when you're working with animals, you can't just say, I'm not going to show up. But by law, they have that right. So dairyman's stuck in the middle where we got to take care of the cow, but we also have laws to protect people. So that means I got to have extra people in case 2 or 3 guys call in sick, because we have to take care of that animal, and it becomes a real challenge for a dairyman. And so there's a cost to that. But then when the dairyman gets his milk check, it's not there. And so we're always talking about how we can make things better for the public, but somewhere along, the dairyman's got to get compensated for that as well. And that's a whole nother subject, I know it. But everything goes up except for the dairyman's check. And he needs to have some kind of, whether you call it an incentive or something, to where, hey, we're doing this, we should make extra money. If we're not doing certain things, then we shouldn't get it. So I don't know what the solution is, but it's a very difficult situation for a dairyman, because he's got so many regulations, which he should have, but at the end of the day, he doesn't make any money, and it's tough.
Thank you. Again, that's Frank Cardoza joining us from Tulare, California. Chris, anything additional to add on this overarching?
I think Rich and Frank did a nice job. I think kind of lack of context for a lot of the general public, as far as remove now multiple generations in most cases from commercial agriculture. And like Rich said, now the availability of social media makes it easier for certain messages to get out there. And I completely agree that the key is to drive the conversation, not be driven by it, because if somebody else is driving the conversation, then you might end up where you don't want to be.
Yeah. Can I add something there, Corey?
Go ahead.
And I want to share just some of the context of these challenges that took place in New York, with really seeing that the arguments from the worker advocacy side versus the industry side of things. And one of the things I will point out is that the industry arguments are always talking about, how they treat workers and trying to make a good case about that as that's already quite positive. And in many, many cases, that is very true. They also, from the industry side, also make an economic argument, which, you're running a business, you're running a dairy farm. And like Frank said, you want to pay your workers, you want to provide all kinds of benefits, but somehow you have to have the income to support, the extra cost of those sort of things. I will state that something that I've seen from the other side, if you will, the worker advocacy side, they have flat out said, at least in the arguments in New York, that it is strictly a justice issue in that, they want to have farm employees at 40 hours overtime, for example. And for them, economics simply do not matter. They want to say that is not part of the discussion. Now, the challenge with that, of course, is that economics do matter, right? I mean, if you can't run a business profitably, then you just won't be there very long. And then the other piece of that is that the employment is tied to that business. So if you can't run a profitable business, you won't have those jobs, and those jobs will disappear. So, legislators are hearing that message, certainly in New York, and they are understanding that there's an economic part of the discussion. But a lot of the folks on the other side, from the worker advocacy side, simply do not appreciate the economics of it and don't consider it as part of the discussion, as a legitimate part of the discussion at all. And so we need to understand that. And I think that the industry needs to also work on its outreach to the general public as well, so that people understand that, yes, there are justice issues involved. Yes, there are principles of good human resource management and taking care of people. There's also a business interest here for individual businesses to continue to survive, and also for those communities, rural communities that depend on them, to also have viable businesses in them.
Okay, we're going to go to speed round here because we got a lot of questions piling up here, and we're going to have to get some responses. So I want to get everybody on the same page on this topic. And one of our question is, how much is considered overtime, like in payment? We've been talking a lot of hours, but in New York, Rich, what is the payment rate for overtime?
I'll give you the simple answer. It's time and a half. It does get a little more complex than that, but basically it's time and a half.
Frank, out in California?
Yep, time and a half.
Okay. Then the follow-up question is, so if you're paying an hourly wage, how does a salary work into that? And what's the difference there, real briefly, Rich?
So salary, only certain employees can qualify really for salary pay, and that's management employees, and some family members can be paid. There's strict limitations on that. Now, again, it can be more complex than that, but I'll leave it at that point. Most of what we call farm laborers, and they've been defined that way, most of our frontline type dairy workers are farm laborers, and in effect need to be paid on a hourly basis rather than salary.
Frank, how was that situation out your way on the dairy that you manage and the farms that you consult with?
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, there is limitations on that. And what makes it difficult is you can pay somebody's salary, but then if they work overtime hours, you've got to pay that. And then that's where it becomes difficult. So for us, you can do salary. We've got 4 individuals that are on salary, but they can't work overtime, and because then you got to calculate that overtime based on salary, and it becomes very difficult. So, yeah, 95% of our employees are on the clock.
Thank you, Frank. We're going to go back to a back and forth here with Frank and Rich on this one, because it's really, what is the minimum wage or hours worked that requires health insurance to be offered? Rich, and what's that look like in New York?
Yeah, health insurance isn't required in New York. So a lot of employers do offer it. Not all employees take it, but there's no specific requirement to offer health insurance.
How about in California, Frank?
Full-time full-time employees.
Okay. So here's another question, and we're going to direct this one to Frank. And it goes like this. We had an overarching question on this. How do patchwork regulations either benefit or hurt dairies in certain parts of the country? But real specifically here, one of the listeners chimes in and says, are dairies relocating out or considering relocating out of California because of these new labor rules? What are you hearing in your circles there, Frank?
You know, I don't hear about it as much. There was a time where there was a lot of dairymen leaving the state. The issue is that things kind of tend to follow California. And I hope I don't sound arrogant when I say that, but it just seems like, we're pushing towards 15 minimum, going to $15 per hour. And I think the new administration is looking at that, to doing it as a federal law. So I don't know. It's very difficult to relocate. Some people are successful at doing that. But I don't think you can run away. If you're moving due to regulations, I don't know if it's worth it.
Well said. We're going to turn to Chris Wolf on this one because this is really an economic question here. And I know Rich talked about in our pregame warm-up yesterday about a dairyman who decided to put a robotic rotary in. But the question here, Chris, is this. At what wage rate does robotic milking replace human labor? And as you're considering answering that one, my in-laws put robots in 21 years ago. And my father-in-law always says, I prepaid my labor. Well, that is a pretty good way of looking at it, but it's more complex than that. So Chris, at what wage rate does robotic milking replace human labor?
Well, that's a good question, Corey. I think there are, in fact, spreadsheets that I can point you to that will help you pinpoint that decision if you want to look at it more, but it's going to depend on a whole bunch of different factors related to what your cost of production are, as far as what you're paying for wages, what you think the future wage rates are going to look like. What you're doing, like you said, is in some sense, you're putting a big investment up front, but don't ignore the fact that you also have maintenance over time. We had a little discussion yesterday about how maybe robots haven't come down in price, but if labor keeps going up, then in a relative sense, they're coming down, right? So, and we're seeing robots not only for the milking, but for many other. I was on a farm last year that was using a robot to pre-clean the cows, to spray them and stuff before, but not for actually putting the milkers on. And then you're seeing the robotic, for pushing up feed and stuff like that. So, I hate to be the economist here. The answer is it depends. At some point it gets high enough, especially if we start considering risks related to immigration, if you're dependent on those type of labor, and other things like that. If we see a $15 minimum wage across the country that they're, actually going to enforce, that's going to change some decisions. So.
Yeah, and I've seen dairies that are side by side, and one dairy is a flat barn, and he has a horrible time finding labor, and the next dairy down the road is a parallel, and he doesn't have as much of an issue. So one guy is looking at robotics, and the other guy says, well, I'm just going to wait. So I think it depends on your facility as well.
And jumping back to, as our viewers know, Andy Novakovic is a regular commentator here too, and he suggested it's perhaps worth mentioning that labor law defines who is exempt and who is non-exempt. It is not as simple as the employer deciding someone is paid on salary versus hourly here. So a good point of information. And the other thing I'd like to remind our viewers, in a later dairy live stream program, we're going to talk about immigration and immigration reform and all that. We purposely and thoughtfully separated that out here just to talk about ag labor here in the situation that we have at hand here. So I'm going to send this one over to Rich here. When considering hourly labor rates, is supplied housing by the employer or other benefits taken into consideration in these calculations?
Yeah, well, so it depends on who you're talking with. So supplied labor or benefits like housing aren't included in the required minimum wages in New York. No, that is straight up cash. That has to be upfront. Now, there are some very small housing allowances that are very difficult for New York farmers to use against the minimum wage, but it's become so difficult that very few people even use them anymore. And they're also very low amounts. They were set back in the 1990s, so they're very, very low. So in effect, that minimum wage is a cash minimum wage that doesn't consider other benefits. I would just to add on that, we've done some work, and actually I'm getting ready to do another salary benchmark study or a compensation benchmark study. And when we calculate the value of additional benefits such as housing and days off and that sort of thing, it's a considerable addition. Typically about 20% of the value of the wage is additional perks, additional benefits.
Frank, anything to add there?
Yeah, I know. Richard's right on that. And just so that everyone's aware, California is looking at adding a tax to robotics because reducing labor will affect payroll taxes. So they found a way to make the money.
Chris, this question, and we have quite an international following here at Hordes Dairyman, and this one I know is coming in from Great Britain, but it applies here and around the globe. Will the COVID pandemic see a reconnection and desire by people to move back to rural areas? Obviously, COVID is a disease of concentration. So if people would, and this is just your thoughts, if people move back to rural areas and value a rural way of life, space, nature, and meaningful work balance, might we see more people coming back to rural America or rural Great Britain, and that impacting labor?
Well, that's a good question. I think it's possible, and then, it probably depends on who's moving back, why they're moving back, and what they want to get out of it when they move back. Because, not to be elitist, but if they're moving from Manhattan to Auburn, New York, they probably don't want to be near a dairy farm. And they probably want to see deer, which, by the way, they will, because there's a ton of them. So then we get into things in this country like right to farm and things like that. Are those people moving back because they want to be part of the workforce? Maybe they're moving back because now they can work from distance, and we're going to have a lot of firms that have now figured out that they can have a lot of employees working from home, and instead of paying for office space in expensive downtowns, they're going to let them work remotely. And now what that means that probably means many good things for rural economies as far as expending money locally. That's great news. It might not mean such good news for neighbor relations and labor. We'll see. That's a great question.
So one of the questions came in here. Dairy is one of the most labor-intensive ag commodities. Is there any hope of separating out restrictions by commodity? And I'm going to put that out to the panel, but I'm going to jump in and answer that one to some degree here. This is really things that happen at state political levels here, and separating out one ag commodity versus another, boy, I see that a mighty steep hill to climb. But if there's a counter opinion to that, I sure like to hear it.
Well, I would actually argue with the questioner a little bit. Labor, and when you look at the percentage of revenues that labor accounts for, dairy is down around somewhere around 10 or 15%, whereas you look at fruits and vegetables, and you're looking at upwards of 30, 40, even 50% of their revenues are eaten up by labor costs. So from an economic standpoint, labor is more intense in some of the other commodities. From my perspective in New York, I would say very little chance of there being a separation like that. And I'd be careful to try to go in that direction, because when you divide up agriculture politically, you might get divided and conquered.
Well said. Frank talked about this a little bit in so much as the question is, are the animal welfare advocates going to eventually have a backlash to robots? Now, Frank talked about it from California that they're going to potentially lose some payroll taxes, so they want to tax robotics. But that's a little bit different twist to that. On that, anyone want to comment on are the animal welfare advocates going to eventually have a backlash to robots?
So a backlash to robots. I mean, going against robots is what you're saying?
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think so. Not in my opinion. That's technology that's moving forward. I don't think there's anything wrong there. It's still, robotics. You still need people with common sense that are not going to be able to, know what a cow, know how to manage a cow. So it's not like it's going to remove all your labor, but so you're still going to have some labor there. No, I don't think so.
Rich, this is an overarching question here, and I don't know how much you've studied this area, but how do U.S. labor laws compare to global competitor nations? Like, let's think of some of our big exporters, the European Union as a bloc or New Zealand there. Any insight on that one?
Yeah, a little bit of insight, and you're right. I'm not fully versed in all these other countries' laws, but in general, in the European Union, labor laws are tighter than they are in the United States, more restrictive, and so I believe there are less exemptions for farm labor in the European Union. An interesting thing that I would share is that the farm labor shortage that we talk about and experience in the United States, that piece of it is not unique to the United States. You can see headlines from Europe, you can see headlines from New Zealand, and you would swear that those came right out of the United States, out of New York or California. It is an international phenomenon that farms struggle to find enough employees.
Frank, there are more expenses to an employee than simply wages. How does the farm owner manager balance workforce size considering other costs like Social Security, health insurance, workers' compensation, overtime, and the list goes on and on?
So I don't understand the question exactly. So you're saying all these added costs to the labor cost is what you're saying?
That's correct. And how do you weigh that into a compensation package? How do you approach that on your dairy and the worms you work with?
Yeah, so what we are offering is, of course, at minimum wage plus a bonus program. And then we do have our insurance program. We do not have, with an exception of 2 employees, we don't offer any housing. So yeah, it's just added cost. There's no way to get out of the Social Security part of it or anything like that. Those taxes have to be paid.
We're going to wrap up with one question here, and we're going to start with Chris and go around the horn here. We'll go Chris, Frank, and then Rich can clean up on this one. We're still obviously operating during a pandemic, and have you seen any COVID labor protocols that might stick around after the pandemic, Chris?
Yeah, I think that this has opened people's eyes to the risk that's related to some of these things. Experiences like this tend to stick with people for a long time. I mean, my grandparents never got over the Great Depression. I'm pretty certain of the way they did some things. And hopefully this has not been that traumatic for everybody, but I think that, recency bias and you tend to worry more about risks that you've experienced. And after having seen this, I think there's a real possibility that people will change the way that they approach employee health and managing the risks around employees.
Frank?
Yeah, no, I think we're going to continue to do many of the things that we've implemented since the whole COVID crisis. And for an example, is my what they use to punch, they use their hands to punch in and out on the clock. I'm looking at getting away from that, just so that, we're not, the chances of spreading anything during that clocking in and clocking out goes away. Yeah, I mean, we've got a spray there, we've got towels and everything, but I'm looking at, something more of a facial recognition or something like that to get away from the possibility of, contaminating that hand clock. Breaks, we've changed, we've limited, our break room can hold a maximum of 4 individuals at once. I think we're going to continue to do that. Just, even if we get past this COVID, there's always flus and other things that are out there. So I think it's, at least for us, we're going to continue many of the practices that we've started with this COVID.
Thank you, Rich.
Yeah, I think a big one is sick leave. Agriculture and farms, it's pretty tough people generally that work on farms, not just the owners and that culture that built up, but also the employees. And that, that has spread throughout the culture. And the reality is that, in the past, people would have a cold or have a sniffle, and well, that didn't keep you from coming to milking cows. People came and went to work unless they were, truly, really sick, flat on their back. So they just came to work. I think that, COVID, that was one of the first things that employers had to rethink that, because like I said to people, one employee's problem can quickly turn into a whole workforce issue when they're bringing a virus like COVID into the workplace. The seasonal flu has been slammed by COVID. It's extremely low levels of seasonal flu this year. And that's because of all the precautions and all the social distancing and mask wearing that we're doing for COVID has just killed the seasonal flu. So I think that going forward, we're going to see sick days as and by the way, New York passed mandatory sick leave for all employers. I think that'll probably spread to other states. Sick leave will remain, and that the culture of farms is going to change such that if you're sick, stay home. We don't really need you to bring that infection and get everybody else sick.
Well, thank you. Our next dairy live stream will focus on how we're evaluating farm loans these days. The show will air on Wednesday, February 17th at 11 p.m. Central Standard Time, and will be archived on the Hordes Dairyman YouTube channel the very next day, just like this program. We look forward to seeing you then. On behalf of Rich Stoop, Frank Cardoza, and Chris Wolf, thank you for joining us today. We wish you all a good day. Take care, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.